This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. As a radio person, I notice sound a lot. I often hear one of my favorite sounds of this season when I go out in my garden to pull weeds and I hear bees buzzing around in the plants. I usually hear them before I can see them. And for me, it's like the sound of my cat purring. Those bees just sound so happy. As you very well might have heard, though, bee populations globally are dropping precipitously. This poses a threat to our natural environment, our gardens, and our farms. The scope of the population loss is hard to grasp. Between June of last year and February of this year, commercial beekeepers in the U.S. lost more than 60% of their honeybees. 60% gone. Last year, in part to help protect pollinators, Vermont and New York passed first-of-their-kind legislation to restrict a widely used type of pesticide called neonicotinoids, or neonics. Usually, neonics enter Vermont by way of seeds. Seed companies treat soybean and corn seeds with them to help keep pests away. Vermont's law was hotly debated because of how it's going to force farmers to change their seed buying practices. Neonics are also used by landscaping companies, golf courses, and other non-farming businesses. Today on the show, we're going to talk through how this landmark restriction on neonics is going to work here and what still needs to get figured out. Joining us this hour from Orwell is Steve Dwinell. He's the director of the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. Their agency is in charge of implementing the neonics law. Steve, welcome.
Well, thank you.
We're glad to have you. We're also joined by Heather Darby of the University of Vermont Extension. She's an agronomic and soil specialist, and she's running research all around the state on how neonics affect crop yields. Heather, welcome back to the show.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And from New York, we have Scott McCart of Cornell University. He's a pollinator health specialist, and he is also in charge of a lot of research in New York, similar to what Heather is doing here in Vermont. Scott, welcome.
Thanks, Michaela, and thanks to be on the show.
So let's begin at the beginning here. Heather, I just gave a very broad overview of what neonics are, but can you tell us a little bit more? Why do seed companies put them on seeds in the first place?
Yeah, well, there are some predominantly really early season pests that can impact crop production here in Vermont. So primarily, you already mentioned with corn mostly, but some soybeans as well. And those early season pests, they're in the soil and they can heavily impact the seed itself. So the seed treatment protects the seed from those early season pests. And that is why farmers in Vermont use them.
But neonics also can be detrimental to the natural environment and to pollinators. Scott, you're an entomologist. Can you tell us more about what these pesticides do to pollinators like bees and butterflies?
Sure. So neonics are neurotoxins. They're really good at targeting pests, like Heather just talked about, but they're unfortunately really good at targeting some of the good guys that we're trying to not target. So neonics, they bind to acetylcholine receptors in nerve cells. Basically, they gum up those receptors on the nerve cells and make it a neurotoxin. This results in overstimulation, paralysis, and death. Unfortunately, it needs fortunately for controlling pests, you need a very small amount of them to control the pests, but also you need a very small amount to have non-target effects. So it's 1,000th of 1,000th of 1,000th of a gram of a neonic is enough to kill a bee.
Wow, 1,000th of 1,000th of 1,000th of a gram. All right, we're talking very, very small amounts here. And New York and Vermont both passed legislation last year to restrict the use of neonics in their states. Tell us about New York's law. You spent a lot of time doing some research as this law was in development, right?
Sure. So we were commissioned by the Cuomo administration back in 2018 to do a risk-benefit analysis for all the major application contexts in which neonics are used. And they're used in a lot of application contexts. They're actually the most used insecticides in the world. So what we did is I teamed up with an economist. I did the pollinator risk side of things, and then the economist did the economic benefit side of things. And we did a comprehensive side-by-side risk-benefit analysis in each of those five major application contexts, summarized it in 432 pages. Took us, 2 years to write the
Summarized in
report.
432 pages.
You got it. Yeah, it took us 2 years to write the report. But yep, no, I think it's been one of the biggest things that I've ever taken part in, and I'm pretty proud of it. I think we've at least as of 2020 had summarized the science pretty well.
And here in Vermont, we have a similar law now on the books as of last legislative session. And as of this July, parts of it are starting to go into effect. More elements of it will go into effect in the years to come. Steve, the Agency of Ag is now in charge of implementing these restrictions and also continuing to figure out how exactly some of the exemptions are going to work. Tell us a little bit more about Vermont's law and your agency's role.
Yes. So we're the agency responsible for implementing pesticide law in Vermont. Act 182, which was passed in 2024, prohibits a number of uses of neonicotinoids and requires some other actions on our part. The July 1, 2025 component that went into effect prohibits the use of neonicotinoid insecticides on certain vegetables that are harvested after bloom, soybeans and other grain crops, corn, and ornamental plants. So that went into effect in July 1. We've been communicating with the regulated community about that, so everyone knows about it. And we're also in the process. One of the things that the law requires us to do is to adopt a set of best management practice rules, which we're in the process of doing right now.
Do you know what the timeline is on developing those best management practices?
Yeah, we've been working on it actually. So the original law that started the process was back in 2022, and so we've been working on developing the best management practices since 2023 actually, and we've been working with the Agricultural Innovation Board, which is a group of citizens and state officials who are appointed by the secretary. We've had, I think, 17 public meetings about those best management practices. We presented it, the draft language to the legislature in February of this year. And then there's other steps we have to go through. But we're at the step now of developing or adopting the rule formally through a public comment process. And we have a whole series of public comment opportunities coming up. If folks are interested, they can go to our website. The Agency of Agriculture website, there's a section called public comment opportunities, and you can see all the we have 4 public hearings and then a virtual public hearing.
Well, speaking of public comment, if you have thoughts on this neonics ban or set of restrictions on neonics, you can call in at 800-639-2211 or email us at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. We're going to start taking your calls in just a moment. But first, Heather, I want to hear a little bit more about the studies that you've been running in Vermont, which are funded in part by the Agency of Ag. What exactly are you trying to learn here?
Yeah, so we are looking at a number of management. Steve already mentioned this, like best management practices. We're trying to monitor and understand these pests better, and generally when they're going to be a significant risk to the farmer themselves. So, the pests are always around, so they do exist. They're sort of opportunists in a way, Most of these pests are generally around, like I said, but it's when all the conditions align, all the stars align, both kind of the environmental conditions, having this susceptible crop, that we see issues with crops themselves. So what we're really trying to understand is, when are we going to see those issues where farmers are going to suffer significant crop loss? And are there ways to manage that? And so, as an example, what we have seen through our research is that these pests are more likely to be present. The probability of seeing damage is much, much higher when the fields are tilled, and also when there is livestock manure applied prior to planting. And so, trying to understand essentially conditions such as those when the crops are most at risk, and how can we manage that? And through planting dates, possibly, maybe through other pest control mechanisms, maybe different rotations. But again, trying to understand when the crops are going to be at most risk and how we're going to manage that.
And Scott, you're working on something similar there in New York too, right? I'm curious, like how much conversation there is between states like Vermont and New York that have similar goals, but also some pretty different climates and sizes of their markets, their ag markets, things like that.
Sure. So I'll answer that in two ways. So first of all, if by me you mean the royal we, then yes, the royal we is definitely working on this here in New York as well. It's a huge team effort. It's primarily led by the Cornell IPM program and a few folks in the Department of Entomology here at Cornell University. And then we are talking quite a bit with Heather Darby. Heather, I'm a huge fan, if you didn't know that already. And we're trying to coordinate, what is going on the ground in terms of some of these test trials, going forward over the next few years, both in Vermont and New York State.
Let's take a call here. We have Anna calling in from Burlington. Anna, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is Anna Stuberling. Thanks so much for taking my call. I'm an environmental advocate with VPIRG, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, and we were one of the groups that helped to pass the legislation that passed last year. And our statewide polling showed that more than 4 out of 5 Vermonters support the phase out of neonics to help protect pollinators. And with that said, my question for your guest, specifically Scott, is like you mentioned, Vermont isn't the only place to have phased out neonics. So what lessons can we learn from other states or countries that have already taken this step? Are there other places where the transition to neonic-free seeds and maybe pesticide-free seeds altogether has worked well?
That's a great question, Anna. I'm going to send us to a short break before we answer it. I'd like all of our guests to weigh in on that. And I'll also note that Quebec banned neonics as well before New York and Vermont did. And I know all 3 of our guests have been thinking about that and how what's going on in Canada can compare to what we're trying to do in a couple states here in the Northeast. So we'll let our guests marinate. And when we come back, we will answer Anna's question and keep talking about these new neonics restrictions here in Vermont and New York. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us.
Thanks for listening to Vermont Edition, where support comes from Wendell's Furniture, home of wendellsdeals.com, offering furniture designed for a range of budgets, in stock and ready for summer. wendellsdeals.com. And Vermont Construction's Roofing Division, offering roof installation and repair with free estimates on asphalt and standing seam metal roofs. Now serving all of Vermont and northern New York. More at vtroofing.com.
Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you're just tuning in, we are talking about Vermont's new ban on neonicotinoids. They're a type of pesticide long used to treat corn seeds, lawns, and ornamental plants, but now they're being restricted to protect pollinators and our waterways. Our guests are Heather Darby, soil specialist at the University of Vermont Extension, Scott McArt, a pollinator health specialist at Cornell University, and Steve Dwinell with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. His agency is in charge of implementing and enforcing the new Neonics law. You can join the conversation as well. Give us a call at 800-639-2211 or email vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Right before the break, Anna in Burlington with the organization VPIRG asked about what we can learn from other places that have already banned neonics. She directed her question first to you, Scott, with Cornell. Let's start with you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Anna. So I love this question. This is a really good question. So there are 3 other places in the world that have put restrictions on neonic seed treatments. The first was the European Union. The second was Ontario, the province just north of us here in New York. And then the third was Quebec, the province just north of Vermont. Those places have restricted neonics, but there has not been a lot of follow-up to see, all right, what has actually happened, to pollinator populations during that time. There has been follow-up to see what the impacts of yield there have been, but not on pollinator populations. So I guess I answer this 2 ways. So one, I think we're in a really great, in terms of lessons learned, I think we're really in a really great position to say, all right, these other places have made these restrictions, but haven't really looked at whether there actually are, positive impacts on pollinators. We are doing that here in New York right now, and I know there's some interest in doing it in Vermont as well. Since this new law, at least in New York, won't go until 2029, we have a few years to take some baseline data and then see if the data changes any after we actually do the restrictions. The second way that I'll answer it is that, yes, we do actually have similar data on yield in all 3 of those locations. So in these places where there have been neonic restrictions on corn and soybean seeds, again, European Union, Ontario, and Quebec, what we've seen is that there's no difference in yield pre and post restrictions in the European Union. We now have nearly 10 years of data post restrictions to address that. And what we have is 8 years of data in Ontario and 6 years of data in Quebec post restrictions. And what we've seen in both of those places is there's actually an increase in yield. And that's statistically significant in both places, that there's actually an increase in yield. So just the opposite of what you would expect if these neonics are really important, for controlling pests. We actually still see an increase in yield. So we're hoping to gather those type of data in New York as well.
Heather, have you found any differences in yield between plots that were treated with neonics and those that weren't in Vermont?
Yeah. So we don't have 10 years of data or even 6 or even 5, but we do have 2. And it depends so far, and we don't have a lot of locations either. So we've been evaluating the use of neonic treated seed or not treated with neonics across 6 to 8 planting dates. And so, as I said, they are early season pests predominantly. And so we would expect that if we were likely going to see a yield difference, that we would see that when possibly farmers are planting very early. And we don't always see that actually. So again, what we have seen is it varies. And sometimes we see the untreated seed performing better. And then sometimes we see the treated seed performing better. And again, that's completely dependent on the planting date. We have seen some matchup, I guess, with pest populations, predominantly seed corn maggot, and their flights. So they have these peak flights. And we have seen only twice a matchup between a peak flight and suppression of yield. So it is and seems to be very variable.
Hmm.
And I will say that we do see pest problems in Vermont, these particular pests that are being controlled by the neonics. So those would include things like white grubs, seed corn maggot, and wireworms. And again, when we see significant issues and major crop loss, they're under very specific conditions. So it certainly isn't at all across the board. And so I think what we're seeing in Quebec and Ontario and in the European Union as well is that the majority of fields are not impacted and that there are specific conditions like anything really, any pest, where there are going to be some issues. And really that is the goal of the work that we're doing and that we're doing in coordination with Cornell as well, is trying to understand when are those risks really, really high, so that we can understand when an exemption may need to be granted.
Right. And one follow-up question there before I get to you, Steve. You mentioned seed corn maggots a couple times. Even if those are present and there's a lot of them, do yields change, or have you found that crops can sometimes push through?
So again, it depends. Sometimes we can see peak flights. So we see a lot of seed corn maggots. It'll sound weird to say we see a lot of seed corn maggots flying, but it's actually flies. And that will not match up with damage in the field. So, there has to be very specific conditions. So sometimes, again, you can see a lot of the pest, but not see a lot of damage. Can the plants compensate? I think is your question. Some plants can better than others. So soybeans in particular can compensate under a range of populations, and sometimes corn can too. But again, we're not interested in the loss of a few plants. We're interested in those conditions where we see significant, seed damage or plant loss.
Right. So, Steve, one element of this we haven't talked about yet, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is the buying of seeds. Now, Vermont is a really small state, and in some ways, the farmers here are sort of at the whims of the big seed industry where they're buying their seeds from. Are you worried about that? About the seed pipeline into Vermont and a change in cost based on this neonics ban on what seeds farmers need to be able to buy?
Yeah, that is a big concern. But before we get into that, I just want to follow up on the comments from Dr. McCart and
Yes, please.
Dr. Darby about the risk. And when Act 182 was written, there was a procedure written into the law for an exemption from the prohibition of the use of the treated seeds if a pest risk assessment was conducted. And that's exactly the research that Heather's working on right now, and we're helping support, which is under what conditions are the risks high enough to warrant the use of the treated seeds. I mean, the contention from a lot of the statements is that there's no difference between the yields from treated versus untreated seeds.
Right.
But just from what we've seen so far in Vermont, Vermont has some very specific conditions where those risks could be substantially higher than they are in places like Quebec or New York or wherever, the European Union, because we have some very specific practices which we encourage. We want farmers to use cover crops. We want farmers to apply manure. There are things that increase the amount of decaying organic matter in the field, which we want farmers to do because it preserves the soil, it reduces runoff, it sequesters carbon, it does all these wonderful things what we want. But those practices could increase the risk to the farmer for their yield, which they need to feed their cows, if we don't use the treated seed. So that's what we're trying to hone in on and figure out specifically what conditions are there that would make a difference to a farmer. And if they didn't use the treated seeds, that they would have significant yield loss, and that would result in them not being able to feed their cows. So anyway, so Vermont's kind of unique. We have some unique conditions, and that's what the law provides for us to develop a Vermont-specific pest risk assessment that would allow for an exemption to continue to use the seeds. So I just want to point that out. But then getting back to your other question, yeah, I mean, between Vermont and New York, we represent just about 1% of the corn seed market in the United States. Okay, so the companies that provide the seed to the corn producers in the United States are geared toward providing seeds that are treated with neonicotinoids, and there's some other insecticides also, so that those farmers can produce the crops in their situation. So if we're coming in and saying we need a special category of seed, there's sort of some economic considerations the seed producers have to consider as to whether they could even provide those seeds. And that's an area we're working on pretty actively. We're staying in close contact with the seed producers. We know who they are, and we're meeting with them. We meet with them a couple times a year just to figure out how they're going to handle this as it comes near. One thing to keep in mind, too, is that the prohibition goes into effect January 1st, 2029, but the decisions about what seed to purchase are made in the fall or maybe even earlier in 2028. So 2028 is actually when the effects of the prohibition will be felt in Vermont.
Scott, do you think that there are barriers right now for growers who want to access untreated seeds? Any market dynamics we should be aware of?
Yeah, certainly not my area of expertise, but I can share that a lot of discussion has been, going on about this. I have many emails on this exact topic in my inbox right now. And yeah, that is a valid question to know, okay, could you actually get untreated seeds, and how readily are those going to be available? My personal opinion on that is it's kind of amazing that we are relying to such an extent on these treated seeds that it's even hard to get seeds that aren't treated. Especially, I guess I want to also acknowledge, yes, I gave you some numbers for sort of overall, geographic areas and whether there's benefits or not benefits of these neonics. But I do want to acknowledge that Heather is absolutely right, Steve is absolutely right. For some farms, there absolutely are, benefits of these. From our data, we show that about 6% of farms benefit economically. That's based off of more than 1,200 field trials that have been conducted on this topic. Other studies that have come out since 2020 show that it's somewhere in the range of 2 to 5% of fields actually benefit economically. So it's not like that doesn't exist, that there is no, benefit. It's just really rare that there's actually an economic benefit.
And are
like
those
Heather
numbers
was
for
saying,
New
it
York State
depends.
specifically or more broadly?
I'm sorry, what?
Are those numbers for New York State specifically or more broad?
So these numbers that I'm giving you right now are broad for the entire literature that has ever been conducted on this.
Okay.
So all of the studies that have ever been conducted in the U.S. or anywhere else. But yeah, no, I guess, and then I will follow up with one more thing, and then we can move on to other folks. But I guess the other thing that I'm really excited about on this topic is this is sort of living science that we're doing over the next 3 years, and I consider this a huge opportunity for science communication. In New York State, we have 60 plots that are scattered throughout the state right now on people's farms, which are comparing neonic versus control trials. So farmers can go out in their own fields, or their neighbors can come around and look and actually see at the stands and see, okay, is there actually a stand loss that's occurring here or not? That's going to go on for the next 3 years. So all of our farmers have done a 3-year contract on this, so all the way up until 2028. And in addition, the crop consultants that are giving them a lot of information have added, we think, somewhere around 40 fields this year. So there's about 100 fields that are going on this particular topic just this year in New York State. I was just up in Utica last week with our Commissioner of Ag and Markets, our Senate Agriculture Chair, and a lot of other folks, who are interested in this topic. And we were just looking at the plots together and saying, all right, what do we actually see here? This is a huge opportunity for people to actually see the proof in the pudding, right? So here's what the science says. I'm giving you the science, but let's put it to the test in real time for the next 3 years and see if people agree or not.
There's lots of interesting threads to pull on here. But before we move on from the topic of buying seeds, Heather, I'd love for you to weigh in there. I know you're in close conversations with farmers all around the states. I wonder if you could help us understand where growers get their information right now in order to make decisions about seeds and any barriers you're hearing about.
Yeah, I mean, it has been difficult to access seed that is not treated with neonicotinoids for probably nearly 15 years. It has become the standard in the industry to treat the seed with neonics. And in order to not get treated seed, as Steve said, an order has to be placed usually in August or September of the prior year. And now that means the seed also comes without fungicide as well, which is also what the seed is treated with. So, the downside of that, of course, is, let's just even take this year, for example. A farmer would buy their normal corn seed. They would ask for it to be untreated. They would receive that over the winter months. And then this growing season happens where it was extremely wet and cold, and farmers' planting for many was delayed by 2 weeks, 3 weeks, some people 4 weeks. And so the normal corn seed that they would plant and they ordered special, they can't use anymore. And at that point, they wouldn't be able to maybe send it back like they normally would. And they also wouldn't be able to access likely any untreated seed if they did exchange. So there's more barriers to just accessing the seed because it's not the norm within the industry. It's like a very special order. Like when somebody orders, a custom made bag, and then all of a sudden they decide they don't like the color and they want to send it back, but there's no returns. And if you just ordered the one that they offered, you have a lot more flexibility, given what other weather conditions might be thrown at you. So I think those are some of the other issues related to seed access. Hopefully, as more states, I'm assuming, and regions kind of move this direction, that there'll be more offerings and flexibility in the marketplace. But this is a real challenge for people.
Heather, your purse metaphor was unexpected but appreciated by us non-farmers. Thank you for that. We don't. Yes,
Michaela, can I make another comment?
Yes, please.
So the other thing, a lot of people don't appreciate when you say corn seed, that's a very generic term, and Heather can talk more about this. But there are literally thousands of different options for farmers when they're selecting the seed, and there are a lot of things they have to take into account. And they order seed in different varieties of seed for different planting dates and different targets for their planting conditions and the nutrition that's produced, and a lot of the corn that's planted in Vermont is used for forage, not for grain. So there's a whole set of genetic attributes that the farmers order to fit their production systems to feed their dairy cows. And it's not, you don't just order corn seed. You're literally catalogs with, hundreds of pages of different, options for the seed you order. And, a lot of the seed that is planted in the United States includes what are called plant incorporated protectants. They're genes that are inserted into the plant to produce proteins that provide protection against a whole series of above ground pests. And the companies that produce these seed, these are very expensive to develop seeds, and so they want to protect those seeds when they sell them in the marketplace, and they do that by adding these fungicides and insecticides. So for some of them, they will not sell the product to a farmer without unless these insecticides and fungicides put on, because they don't want to be blamed for a crop failure, and they're expensive. So the net result of all that is when you prohibit the use of the neonicotinoid insecticides, it's going to automatically reduce the selection of seeds that farmers are going to be able to purchase and plant. Okay. So the production systems that the farmers have developed over the years in order to stay in business, and it's a narrow margin business, a lot of that's going to have to change. And it's very uncertain how that's all going to play out.
Well, I got to jump in here. I'm sorry, because we do need to take a short break. And I want to, before we do, I want to read an email that a listener named Barbara sent, who is really excited about Vermont's new ban on neonics, or restrictions on neonics. Barbara writes, "This year's complete lack of any bees in my garden, a huge change from previous years, is alarming to me. So is the relative lack of songbirds, which must also be suffering from insect loss. It's almost another silent spring in my garden," Barbara writes, compared with previous years. So sad. Since about 35% of food crops depend on pollination, the food supply is at risk from this decline of pollinators. We're talking about the new neonics restrictions in Vermont as well as New York State. We're going to take some of your calls. Vanessa in Ferrisburg, I see you on the line. We're going to get to you in just a moment. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. If you are just tuning in, this hour we are discussing Vermont's new law on neonicotinoids. They are a type of pesticide that is used to treat seeds that are commonly used in agriculture, but neonics also can negatively affect pollinators such as bees. Now, researchers, state officials, and farmers are figuring out how to implement this new neonics law on the ground. Our guests are Heather Darby, a soil specialist at the University of Vermont Extension, Scott McGart, a pollinator health specialist with Cornell, and Steve Dwinell with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. Let's go to the phones here. We have Vanessa in Ferrisburg on the line. Vanessa, go ahead.
Hello, I've been listening to this, and I'm all for the pollinators pollinating and the small mammals surviving. But how does water interplay into this scenario? 200,000 people around the lake take their drinking water from Champlain, and the streams, creeks, and rivers from the farms run down into the lake where we draw our water from. We know that the water departments clean it, but we've had many different posts saying, no, don't drink the water. You can use it, but don't drink it. Neonics are neurotoxin. So I would just like to ask how we are considering the water in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Yes, we've talked a lot on this show about how agricultural runoff goes into our lakes and streams and can affect water quality here in Vermont. Scott, I know you're not in Vermont, you're in New York, but you did bring up earlier the fact that neonics are a neurotoxin and negatively affect bees and other pollinators. Can they also affect humans through drinking water?
So I guess two ways to answer this question. So number one of the main reasons why neonics are used, other than being very effective against crop pests, is they're pretty non-toxic to humans. So compared to some of the older chemistries like organochlorines, organophosphates, some of the things that, I'm sure if folks are a little bit older on and listening, things that were used in the 50s, 60s, 70s, neonics are much less toxic to humans. But the second way to answer this is, where are these neonics actually going, and what effects might they be having on various other organisms? So about 2 to 3% of the neonic is actually taken up by the plant. So if it's, again, these coated seeds, if they're trying to target or protect that plant against early season pests, and it's about 2 to 3% of the neonic that actually goes to the plant. About 2 to 3% is also lost as dust during planting. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with, if you either have a farm yourself or you've, driven by in sort of early summer and seen people planting fields, it's usually a plume of dust that's going up. And when neonic treated seeds are used, about 2 to 3% of the neonic from those seeds is included in that dust. If that falls on various things outside of the field, then of course those things, like pollinators, can be exposed. But the big part of where the neonics go are into the water and soil and non-crop plants. That's about 90% plus goes into the soils, goes into surface waters, and potentially into groundwaters. So I'll stop there and then let others chime in.
Heather, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, Steve can speak to if the state is monitoring neonics in water, but we have been, part of the research that we're doing is to manage what's called the like dust off, which is the dust coming from the planters. And the neonics that kind of get chipped off the seed and might make their way into the dust that goes into the environment. So we have been evaluating that through research to try to understand how can we minimize the amount of dust. And the amount of dust that's created really is dependent on the seed itself, the company, and how the seed is treated. Sometimes on the planter, but a lot on the conditions during planting. And so this year was extremely wet. Last year was extremely wet as well. So there really wasn't any dust. And we we were conducting our trials trying to pick up dust, and we weren't able to get dust because of the actual soil conditions around us. So there's a lot we can do to manage, again, the risks of movement, like Scott's talking about. What I feel like we know a little bit less about is movement, off field into water. We are monitoring fields now at some of our research sites to look at if neonics are being lost into the water off from edge of field sites. And then we're also monitoring degradation in the soil, because that is also a concern. So through our research, we're trying to address those concerns and understand them better too. But as far as if the state monitors that currently, Steve may better know
Steve?
the answer to that.
Yes, we do. We have an active surface water and groundwater monitoring program, and we include the neonicotinoids in that sampling program. We have detected neonicotinoids I'm just pulling up the latest numbers here right now. We have detected it in surface water as in runoff from farm fields, but they've all been found at like less than 1 part per billion. And there is no drinking water standard for neonicotinoids, and that's most likely because of like Scott said, they're very low mammalian toxicity. They're not considered a risk in drinking water. But they do occur in surface water at very low levels. And that is one of the issues we have to deal with in terms of managing. But that we have to do that for all pesticides. We have to manage risks and figure out ways to do it. The dust off problem that Scott mentioned and also that Heather mentioned is something that we're looking at, and we're hoping we get some good research results from Heather on ways to minimize that, so that between now and when the prohibition goes in effect, we can have best management practices for the farmers to minimize any dust risk. And then once the prohibition does go into effect, and if we issue an exemption, then those best management practices can be applied to minimize risk.
We got an email from Harry in Cornish, New Hampshire, who says, "It's about time, ban them. Poisoning the environment to curate your lawn should be a crime." As Harry might be nodding to, this ban doesn't just affect farmers, it also affects landscapers and people who use neonics to treat ornamental plants. It does not affect golf courses. Scott, I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit about that. I know that there is one state, I believe it's Connecticut, that has decided to ban the use of neonics on golf courses. Vermont has not. I don't know if that's included in New York's law. Do you have more information there?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure where things are in Connecticut, but I can tell you about New York. So in December 31st, 2024, so just about a half a year ago, New York restricted use of all insecticides containing clothianid and dinotefuran. So those are two neonics on outdoor ornamental plants and turf, except for use in agricultural production. Coming up in December 31st, 2026, so that's going to be a year and a half from now, New York is going to restrict the use of the rest of the active ingredients, the rest of the neonics, imidacloprid, thiamethoxam, and acetamiprid, for ornamental outdoor plants and turf, again, except for agricultural production. And then what we've been spending the lion's share of this discussion on is what's going to happen in 2029. And that's the prohibition of this agricultural use, which is by far the biggest use of neonics in the world, these seed treatments on corn and soybeans especially.
Heather, I'm wondering, since you're working so closely with farmers here in Vermont to adapt to these changes, does the conversation ever come up around other uses of neonics that aren't included under this new Vermont law, like golf courses?
I would say probably did more initially. I think, farmers want things to be fair.
Yep.
Why do other people get to use these? But I also feel like our farming community here in Vermont is highly engaged in the conversations around environment and conservation. And, Vermont has adopted more conservation practices than any state in the nation. The farmers are generally well aware of environmental issues as they arise, and then adapt and change as needed. But what they really want is science behind it. And that, I think, is what I've heard the most, is that they want to see, and Scott mentioned this too, the science in their backyards. They want to see the science in their field. They want to hear from the people, in their own state under their conditions, so that they can do their best. And I don't think, or none of the farmers I know, want to do something of detriment to their neighbors or to their family or to their own farms. So I think, people are highly engaged in the conversation at this point, and that's why we have lots of participation. Same with New York, with farmers wanting to be part of the science and part of figuring out solutions and management to do better. So, yeah.
Heather, you've done me a great service by leaving us at a perfect spot. We have to wrap up this conversation for today, but I so appreciate all of our guests for sharing their expertise. Heather Darby with the University of Vermont Extension, thanks as always for your time.
Thank you.
And we had Steve Dwinell with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. Steve, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
And Scott McCart with Cornell University. Scott, it's been great learning about New York from you.
Thanks, Michaela. I'm a big fan of Vermont, so happy to be on.
Well, that is all the time that we have for today's show. Thanks to everybody who participated in this conversation via email and phone and on our Instagram at Vermont Public. Today's show was directed by Mary Engish. John Ahrens is our managing producer. Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro are our producers. Our intern is Callie Knuxerl, who is also our call screener today. Our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.